Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear friends, dear fellows, it is for me obviously a great privilege to present you the last plenary before of the last plenars and workshops at 4:30. We'll present you the program. We will have this plenary until close to 4 o'clock. And immediately thereafter, there will be the Rinnus Peninx Best Paper Award, presented by Rinnus Peninx, and maybe also by Ina Michalovsky if she's here, but I don't think so. And then there will be the closing remarks by Maurice Krull, and followed by the coffee break. And 4:30 p.m. start the last workshops in our conference, the 2015 IMISCOE conference here in Geneva. For me, it's an incredible pleasure to have this dream team here on the panel discussing together the issues of rights and democracy as an antagonistic relationship in the European migration policy, as question mark. Patrick Weil was already in Neuchâtel 10 years ago, where he made a brilliant talk on his experiences to consult policy from an academic perspective. And I think he's still in the business. Giovanna Zincone and Rainer Bauböck, 20 years ago, organized a workshop, an ECPR workshop on citizenship, which was the start for many of the younger fellows to start and interest themselves in citizenship issues. And this is obviously an indication that it is helpful to have places and platforms like these in order to give all of us chances to meet and to continue our research. Maybe I present the panelists before we go over to the presentations. Giovanna Zincone is the founder and the president of FIERI, which is a forum like the Swiss Forum for Migration Studies. It's a forum which tries to join research with policymaking. She's political professor. She was professor of political science at the University of Torino. She was president of the National Commission for the Integration of Immigrants in the past, between 1999 and 2001. She was for the presidency of Giorgio Napolitano, a consultant to the President of the Republic in Italy. And she is still a commentator to La Stampa, the newspaper, the daily newspaper of Torino.
It's an Italian newspaper.
I know, it's obvious. La Stampa, the press. Patrick Weil. He's now at the moment visiting professor of law and fellow in global justice at the Yale Law School in Yale. He's a senior research fellow at the French National Research Center at Sorbonne 1 in Paris. In 2003, he was the member of the Presidential Commission on Secularization by President Chirac. I know him basically for my own research for his job done in 1997 for Lionel Jospin, the Prime Minister, where he completed his report on immigration and nationality, a very important report that was transferred also in the implementation of the new immigration and citizenship law in France. And he's currently also a professor at Paris School of Economics. He comes to publish, he told me before, to publish a book, Le Sens de la République. Maybe we'll have some information also on this debate in Paris and in France today. Rainer Bauböck is, as I said, one of the greatest teachers, I would say, in citizenship studies possible to think of. He is chair of the Social and Political Theory chair of the European University Institute in Florence. He was interested in normative theory, in comparative research on many subjects, immigration, nationalism, citizenship, minority rights, And he's coordinating together with Joe Shaw and Martin Fink, which is also here in the room, the UDO project, European database, an observatory basically on democracies, but basically addressed on citizenship, laws, and rights. Not only in Europe now, they have expanding to many other areas of the world and now are also thinking to go to more west to the Americas. So, the theme of today is rights and democracy, an antagonistic relationship in European migration policy. We heard at the beginning of this conference, we had a fervent debate on the theme, to which extent human rights are eroded by democracy. And as you know, and as it was told on Thursday, in Switzerland there is a pending initiative who would like to strengthen domestic law against international law. And yesterday we heard also by Sandra Lavenet in her comments that basically there isn't only a sort of procedural majority-addressed interpretation of democracy, which is only working with majorities to be equated by popular vote or by parliamentarian vote, but there is also, democracy is also linked to a substantial meaning, to liberal values, which have to be kept in mind when we are talking about these issues. But what is this, the substantive meaning? Maybe we will hear something more. Who is defending them, basically, when they are at risk? Today, I would say we are confronted with a crisis of democratic regimes. This was also Sandra Lavenet's meaning. And for that reason, it would be important to see who is upholding, who is defending the substantive meanings of democracy. We will start with Giovanna Zincone and her presentation, also addressing the situation in Italy. Then we will switch over to Patrick Weil, and Rainer Bauböck will be the discussant. After that, we will pose questions to the audience. I mean, the audience can pose questions to the panelists. Maybe also the other way around. It wouldn't be so bad. The expertise is not only here in front of you, it's all over the place. So, Giovanna Zincone, you have the floor.
Okay. Well, why this provocative title? Even if we are aware, to superquote Bauböck, of the super diversity of treatment reserved to different categories of aliens, and of the super diversity of our democratic systems, yet in the background we still can detect a sort of structural matrix, which we may identify already in the Athenian democratic archetype, that embodies some recurrent attitudes of closure towards the foreigners, oi barbaroi, the barbarian. My presentation advances, summarizing. First, I will start by singling out the feature of the original democratic matrix, as it is defined in the Athenian archetype. Then I will recall some of the present security, cultural, economic challenges to the matrix and their different strengths in different European countries. I will recall some consequences of the challenges on migration policy and immigrant rights, but on the other hand, I will also notice the resistance of some rights. To explain this relative resistance, I will propose a scheme which summarizes the classical liberal counterweight to the demos. And, as suggested by Gianni, I will devote more attention to the Italian case. Then I will conclude by underlining the fragility of mere non-political, if you want, liberal counterweights. Move. My friend knows that I'm very absent-minded. To identify the matrix feature, we may refer to the famous funeral oratio of Pericles, as reported by Thucydides, which represents the quintessence of the Athenian myth and an archetype of the democratic matrix. it is also a starting point to identify some of the factors that, in a democratic discourse, may identify the risk alien pose and consequently of the reason for their exclusion. I read just few telling lines of the oratio because I think that many of you are familiar with this speech. The famous one, our Constitution does not copy the laws of neighboring states. We are rather a model to others than imitators ourselves. Its administration favors the many instead of the few. This why is called a democracy. Nobody need to be ashamed to admit poverty, but it is shameful not to do one's best to escape from poverty. There is no exclusiveness in our public life and in our private business. We are not suspicious of one another, not angry with our neighbor, even he does what he likes. We do not put our sour looks on him, which, though harmless, his behaviors are not pleasant. And as an old liberal, this is the line I love best. In short, Pericles continues, I assert that the city of Athens, taken all together, is a model for all Greece. What really characterizes the self-portrait of the polis is the idea of the superiority of its cultural values, which include tolerance, and the belief of the superiority of its political institutions. This political and cultural pride implies a certain diffused contempt towards foreigners because of their backward attitudes and behaviors. In the ancient Greek language, the word for alien was barbaroi, from the onomatopoeic barbar, stutterer. Other relevant reason of suspicion towards the aliens were grounded fears of disloyal insider. The risk that domestic subversive groups could ally themselves with foreign and democratic powers ready to attack the country and overthrow democratic institutions. Pericles introduced the first nationality law in Europe, and this is something that can interest you, probably you already know that. The law embodied the restrictive criteria of dual ancestry. That's it, being born by an Athenian father and an Athenian mother. The law aimed at both excluding non-democratic outsider and avoiding an overstretching of the Athenian proto-welfare. Whose main provision was, but was not the only one, the distribution of the surplus crop among the citizens. Till then, it was taken for granted that citizens were those people born and residents in the country who were neither immigrants nor slaves. Let us now move to the current challenges to the matrix, if I remember it. The current matrix under stress. Well, though many threats to democracy have historically come from within, I focus here only on threats perceived as coming from groups of alien origin, because these can possibly influence the attitude of the demos towards immigration and produce anti-immigrant measures. The presence in our society of religious minority of immigrant origins, difficult to integrate in a democratic sphere, is felt as a problem also by progressive political theorists. As John Rawls illustrated in Political Liberalism, liberal democratic states live out of pluralism. They are supposed to be hospitable also towards communities that have strong, comprehensive creed, provided that they accept the needed overlapping consensus on constitutional essentials. Unfortunately, democracy, as Rawls notices, hosts also comprehensive and reasonable groups, which want their creed imposed in the public arena. Rawls is referring in particular to Muslim minorities. On this point, the Athenian notion of cultural superiority of democracy vis-à-vis backward aliens may be seen as still playing a role in shaping public opinions. Comprehensive groups some immigrant cultural minority can be considered as characterized by retrograde gender and parenthood relations, by inadequate familiarity with democratic and secularized values, in particular as regards religious pluralism. They can thus be framed as a disturbing element in democratic cohesion. This sort of general cultural contempt can be accompanied by more specific fear. I'm referring to the fear of domestic disloyalty, to the fear of terrorism of Islamic imprint, which does not seem strongly enough condemned and isolated by immigrant co-religionists. The long series of dramatic terrorist attacks, which had yesterday the last shocking episode, are obviously having a strong impact on public opinion. The asymmetric transnational war led by Islamist groups such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State may trigger another factor inherent to the matrix, the fear of aliens as fifth columns of foreign powers. Although not scientifically reliable, a recent Al Jazeera survey that showed an 80% support to Islamist group was quite shocking. The dramatic increase of mixed inflows perceived as a sort of barbarian invasion is reinforcing not just cultural insecurity, but also economic concern. If we move the focus, third part, if we move to focus on some economic challenges, we can notice that they can impact, in a way, even more strongly on immigrant rights. I limit myself to mention just two main points. First, the present or the future risk of major fiscal crisis is already well perceived by all OECD governments, and these governments have mostly adopted self-imposed constitutional constraints or accepted binding rules decided by international bodies. In particular, the European Union did so through the 2012 Fiscal Compact. Consequent spending constraints implied a reshaping of welfare provisions, mainly of pension and public health, and have fostered a measure aimed at managing the access to labor market by foreigners in order to maximize the perspective of public revenues and minimize the risk of future fiscal burdens. I'm going too quick. No. Okay. Second, the economic crisis which hit, though to a different extent, our economies and increased unemployment rates in many European countries, and had often especially impact on immigrant workers, increased concern about immigrant welfare burden and domestic low-skilled workers' displacement. Let us give a look to some data on the dimension of the quoted challenges. Yuck. No, sopra. Sorry, I prevented you. The unauthorized influx had increased dramatically at the European external borders in the last years. And we are all aware that certainly of course, we know that certainly Europe is not the most affected region by this phenomenon. However, the perception of this issue, also because of its mediatization, impacts on public opinion strongly, on electoral behavior, on election outcomes. Part of the so-called mixed inflows resulted in important growth rates of asylum seekers, especially in some countries, for instance, Hungary, Italy, but also Germany and Sweden. And now, in fact, if you look at this slide, we can notice the rapidity of the growth, which may play an even more important role than absolute numbers in the public perception. These figures may help in explaining the attempted, so far, rejection of the Dublin Convention by Hungary and what is happening, the dramatic situation at the French-Italian borders. Summing up the situation, unauthorized influx and refugee flows are producing extremely tense relations among the Union members and are threatening, this relation we saw a few years ago, and are threatening two EU milestones, namely the Dublin Convention and Schengen Agreement. Also, unemployment can play a role in orientating voters' behaviors and consequent migration policy. And as we can see in the following slide, also these data are quite dramatic, especially in some countries. Okay. Here, if you look here, you can see that the southern European countries are particularly hit by unemployment of national workers. On the other hand, Sweden, for instance, is dramatically hit by foreigners' unemployment. So there is not a direct connection between national unemployment and foreign unemployment. That's something that we know very, very well, but the rate of immigrant unemployment is, in general, tends to appear ceteris paribus higher than that of national, because as we all know, they have a higher rate of activity. So if you have a higher rate of activity, the same reason why sometimes women look less unemployed than men, because sometimes they have low rate of activity. However, the gap between national and immigrants, when it is relevant, in some countries like Sweden, may produce anti-immigrant attitudes and may suggest restricted labor inflows policy. So even if a country have not so much problem as far as national concern, may have some problem when the rate of foreign workers unemployment is too high. The perception of the gap should be different when also national levels of unemployment are so high, because in this case, this fact monopolizes the public attention, and this is what is happening in Southern European countries. Southern European workers are much more concerned by their own unemployment than by their employment of non-national. Also because these non-national are increasingly leaving our countries. These and other challenges, some of them have already started before the more recent crisis, have produced and are still producing reduction of immigrant rights and tightening of migration policy. A recent report of the European Parliament surveyed a reduction of fundamental rights after the 2008 crisis, which is affecting all weaker strata, not just immigrants. For instance, disabled people are strongly affected by the crisis. This conclusion is not comforting anyway, because poor people competition on scarce resources can be a supplementary source of interacting conflict, as many researchers, in particular at local level, have already shown. I do not want to recall the long list of measures adopted to discourage unskilled inflows and to limit immigration access to welfare, this phenomenon of the shifting borders. The increasing concern and measure regarding the mobility and right, even of the EU citizens, were and are object of many analyses and research by our network. What we may consider more interesting, maybe, as social scientists, is not so much the restrictive response coherent with the demos concerns, but the relative resistance of migration and of some migration migrants' rights. Two foreseeable consequences of the economic and cultural challenges should be having. First, a drastically reduced inflows, in particular labor migration, and to deeply undermine multicultural measures. In fact, these hypotheses are partially disproved, very partially disproved. We all know that inflows did not stop, often producing still positive net balance. This was mainly due to family reunion and asylum. These rights, in fact, were smooth, but were not, at least so far, drastically restricted. The action of national and European courts, which are usually particularly sensitive on this matter, proved to be quite effective. On the other hand, I would like to focus on one, the first time I will do another time. First, focus on a legal concept, the difference between prescriptive and orientative right. For instance, in Italy, we have the first article of our constitution is, our constitution is based on labor. That means that in theory, we should aim at full employment. Of course, it's just orientative. On the other way, the third article is anti-discrimination, and this article is prescriptive. Well, what I'm now suggesting is that now asylum is becoming more and more an abstract right, an orientative right, since we do not allow refugees in Europe. We don't let them to cross our borders. We do our best not to let them cross our borders. So in theory, we accept refugees. In practice, we don't. As labor migration is concerned, I would like to mention an empirical research carried out in 6 countries, directed by Pastore. Now I start quoting a lot of research in which theory was involved, because I'm here as a sponsor of theory, which demonstrates that under, I quote Ferruccio, under the frozen surface of alleged zero labor migration doctrines, linkages between population movement and labor dynamics were persistent and still strong. Migrant labor supply policy find different paths of least resistance to satisfy labor demand without alarming the public opinion. While all governments pretend to give priority to the less alarming high-skilled workers, and in fact they do, however, they also accept unskilled workers, as in Sweden by devolving responsibility to the employers, that's it, to the market. I wanted to underline the market. Or in Germany, by stretching the high-skill criteria by administrative devices. Or in the UK, where even if reluctantly, EU mobility provides also low-skilled or high-skilled de facto working in low-skilled jobs. You know that quite recently Cameron complained because he said, I don't want this brain drain from Italy. I'm too sorry. As Salis notices, the Italian least resistant path is offered by the caregivers, needed by families and quite popular in the Italian imaginary. So under this armor-less category of immigrants, also other kind of low-skilled workers were included in planned inflows or regularized a posteriori. In a globalized competitive economy, multiculturalism is becoming an asset as chemical neoliberalism, multiculturalist perspective suggests. We were in Badia to listen to his lecture. The EU Commission as well, in 2013 document, shares this perspective and underlines the positive aspect, not just the problem, the positive aspect of diversity management. When it comes to nationality law, Bauböck, Vink, and Dumbrava, having taken into consideration a consistent set of variables, reached the conclusion that there is not a uniform restrictive trend. And we can consider nationality as the more symbolic and sensitive of the immigrant rights. And then Ryder will scold me. On the other hand, Even restrictive measures such as civic integration contracts, courses, and tests do not produce necessarily only restrictive results. This measure can be considered as a sort of European combined answer to both cultural and economic challenges, since they openly aimed to foster both cultural and economic integration and indirectly to discourage unwanted inflows. In fact, their capacity to reach this aim is still under scrutiny. On the other hand, surprisingly, civic integration courses were often positively judged by their participants, as for instance, Capone reported in the ProSint project. Rights and duties are not always antagonist, as we tend to think when referring to immigrant duties. The legal concept of right duty is a legal concept. Demonstrate that they can be coupled. For instance, in all democracy, children education is a right for the children and a duty for the parents. In some political system, and this used to be true in Italy, vote is considered a right duty. Stuart Mill, in the representative government, affirms implicitly a similar concept when he maintains that it is reasonable not to enfranchise incompetent people, but at the same time, he considers a strict duty of a liberal regime to enable poor, ignorant people to become competent. To reach this fundamental aim, according to Stuart Mill, educational opportunities are the main tool, and they should be cost-free or at least affordable by poor people. While the Dutch civic education model contradicts Mill being a too heavy burden on immigrants' shoulders, the Italian case contradicts Mill's recipe for the opposite reason, being super light and completely ineffective, a paper right and as well as a paper duty. In fact, it makes compulsory only 10 hours course and requires a very low standard, poorly checked language test. The Italian case highlights not only the inconsistent and superficial nature of supposedly policy transfers, but also the complexity of the decision-making reaction in face of the mentioned challenges. Let us now move briefly to treat the Italian case, if I have time. Well, Italy experienced a long political phase in which, even not without interruption, a center-right majority ruled the country. That winning coalition included a xenophobic component, and yet, even under these circumstances, the policies were less coherent and restrictive than we may have expected. The action of the courts were able to nullify many anti-immigrant measures, in particular those aimed at undermining health and educational rights of the undocumented migrant. The organized civil society played a crucial role as well. Even though during the electoral campaign, according to Edelman's thesis, politician rhetoric is addressed to the electorate, when in government, even certain right parties should take into consideration the interest of the lobbies. And as I've already written in several works, Italian pro-immigrant benevolent lobbies are particularly strong, and in alliance with employers were able to obtain frequent mass regularization. Pragmatic problem solving can also explain recurrent, huge regularization even under center-right governments. In a context of financial difficulty, mass regularization are also devices to cash administrative fees right now and to raise public revenues in future by receiving more taxes and contributions. The Italian case offers the opportunity to explain an interesting aspect of electoral behavior. Not always strong anti-immigrant opinions translates into anti-immigrant votes. Anti-immigrant opinions. My husband sent me another slide, but I didn't dare to put these last slides in here. that demonstrates that the Italian attitudes toward immigrants are even worse. So the strong anti-immigrant attitude of the Italian electorate in 2014 are absolutely clear from this Eurobarometer 2014 survey. But there are many other surveys telling the same story, including this last one, my husband one. It is thus quite surprising that in the 2014 European elections, strong anti-immigrant opinions were not able to translate into rightist parties' victories. On the contrary, this election rewarded, as never before in Italy, a center-left party. We may find a first explanation in the fact that the radical anti-immigrant parties ran divided, and they were not allied with their traditional party, the Berlusconi party. In the EU election, while the proportional system encouraged fragmentation, the 4% representation threshold penalized small radical right-wing parties. However, parties' alliance and the electoral system cannot explain, in fact, the unfavorable translation from, unfavorable for them, of course, translation from xenophobic vote into set. But they cannot explain the huge movement of votes towards the democratic parties, toward a center-left party. While as historians and political and social scientists, we always give relevance to the role played by individuals, we tend to underestimate this role when we look at the normal functioning of the democratic machinery. The center-right victory can be found in the ability of its leader Matteo Renzi to create a narrative amplified by media which distinguishes himself from the incumbent. The incumbents are not doing so well in this period. In the incumbent majority, casting himself in the role of wrecker of the leftist traditional elite. Another often underevaluated aspect is the relative positioning of the hierarchy of public concern. As we can see in this other, very close to the end. Don't worry. Due to the general context of economic crisis, unemployed fears and the need of an economic recovery were more salient than ever, and Renzi was able in focusing his electoral campaign on this issue, overshadowing the immigration issue. However, the center-left superiority is now under pressure, and we can grasp it by looking at the last electoral results. Have I time to the slide to explain? Sure. Okay. The result of 2015 regional and local election registered a big leap forward of the Northern League. The League has casted aside its traditional theme of devolution and even secession in favor of strongly xenophobic focus. It was already in power in Lombardy, a region we didn't vote this time, as well in Veneto, where its power was clearly confirmed. They received a lot of votes. But what surprised and scared more the Renzi PD majority was the League's dramatic electoral success outside its traditional heartland, into northern and central Italian regions once dominated by the leftist party. Again, part of this result can be explained by the fact that the center-right parties were allied, by contrast with the previous election. They were allied when they needed. While the center-left in some cities ran divided after heavy split, and also the still formally united PD showed deep internal cleavages, which troubled the electorate and produced other defection and split immediately after the election, a few days ago, for instance. Again, the role of individuals proved fundamental. The young Northern League leader, Matteo Salvini, in Italy we talk about the two Matteo Salvini, Matteo Renzi, was capable to vocally invade any kind of new and old medias. He was able to couple the immigration issue with anti-EU stances, blaming EU for impairing the Italian economic recovery because of coercive austerity and for the consequence of the Italian export of the sanction imposed to Russia. Paradoxically, the relative success of Renzi government in improving the economic situation left space to another issue, and immigration became the main character of the play because of the increase of unauthorized influence in Italy and the media dramatization where the notion of invasion was repeatedly used, and in fact, the unauthorized influence increase was there. Here the increase, I jump because it's too easy, I skip, okay, whack. On the other hand, leftist voters are not immune from anti-immigrant attitudes and are exposed to anti-immigrant party appeal. And here we have this quite interesting survey. You see that 69% are the Italian, but also the left part of the electorate is not so happy about migration, and here again, not about Muslim. Obviously, this I will skip rapidly and come to the conclusion. Well, these are the results. I was just making you notice something that you already know very well. This is not just an Italian problem. This is a European problem. And if we look, these are just on, because for the sake of simplicity, I used the European election. But if you look at the election that were after the European election, well, in Sweden, for instance, or in Finland, this xenophobic party had even better results. So, I'm quite summing up. In this challenging, in this challenging political scenario, can we still rely on what we could define as liberal counterweight to the demos will? I define as liberal in a more European, not American acception, and so that's why I can insert the market in a liberal model. They have undoubtedly play an important role, as we have seen in the Italian case, but also on larger European scale. However, I suggest to define them just as potential counterweight, because they've not always acted as protector of human rights in the past, and I'm not sure that we will be able to do that always in the future. Many pro-immigrants, but also some adverse rulings on constitutional and Supreme Courts are reported in the book I edited with Rinnus, Peninx, and Mare Borket. Let me just recall some examples of the adverse rulings. No, I'll just refer to the last one, because we can find all these examples in the book, and I do not want to steal too much time to Patrick. Allora, also the 2013 Greek Council decision against the 2010 youth soldier reform can be considered another of the many examples that we have given in our book of the relative fragility of our counterweights. Market forces, they have their own reasons, not always overlapping with more openness in migration policies. The capacity of organizing immigrant civil society to influence decision-making is not always bound to find a window of opportunity in government which include strong xenophobic parties. And the domestic barbarian, in fact, a large part of our demos, more often vilified than understood, are just a threat to be kept under control with the mentioned liberal counterweights? Are we not in need of political counterweights that will work within democracy and not outside? If Gianni weren't here, I would dare to say that we probably need a sort of well-rooted constructive populism as counterweight to destructive ones.
That would be okay.
Finito.
Thank you. I don't think that I would be against this sort of populism. Also, I mean, because somehow some people would have to defend also democracy and also certain values of democracy, and for that reason, they have also to get into the arena of defending these issues. We will now switch to Patrick Weil. You have the floor, Patrick, and hear from him his approach to the issues of vulnerability of democracies and how they have to react. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Patrick, distance. Il faut avoir la distance.
Distance?
Oui, très bien. C'est comme ça.
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. So, on December 10, 1948, the General Assembly of the new United Nations adopted a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, who proclaimed many rights, but this declaration was not binding, contrary to another one that was passed a few years later, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And my first question is, among these rights which were proclaimed, which one has become real and have really become universal, as that was the purpose of the declaration? Maybe you will contradict me, but I find only one who is now, at least legally, absolutely forbidden in any place of the world, which is to have a human being as a slave. After it was proclaimed first by, I think, the French Revolution 1794, but then reapplied in France by Napoleon. So since 1794 it was first declared abolished, it took 2 centuries to make it an absolute right, at least I say in laws, of every part of the world. What about the others? So then you could say there is one other that is not far from being absolute, at least when it is not given to a human being. The community of nations have declared that people need a proxy of it. It is citizenship, which was not part of the binding covenant I mentioned to you, was proclaimed right to a nationality in the December 1948 declaration, but in fact has become special for all parts of the world, including dictatorship and theocracy, etc. And if you don't have it, or if you have lost the legal basis of it, there is a convention of the United Nations for the protection of stateless or refugees that give you the 2, I would say, legal resources of the nationality. First of all, the protection of the United Nations and some rights on the territory, on the country on which you reside. So isn't it paradoxical, to come back to the theme of the conference? If I come back to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you were mentioning how old we are. All the conversation we had about rights beyond citizenship, etc., etc., and when we look at the facts, when we look at the reality of what has been achieved in this program, that was a program of 1948, the only right that is still, it is the right to have a citizenship. So, as you know, Hannah Arendt said in her book about totalitarianism that citizenship was the right to have rights. She didn't say only that in this book and in this part of her book. but it tends to make us think that she had a point, saying that to get rights, you need some basis, and that the basis is to have the citizenship or the proxy of it. And from that, you create the rest of the rights. What is interesting, and I go further on Arendt, is that she did not only say that that was the right to have rights. She said something, and I will quote her. Since the rights of man were proclaimed to be inalienable, irreducible to, and undissociable from other rights or laws, no authority was invoked for their establishment. Man himself was their source as well as their ultimate goal. No special law, moreover, was deemed necessary to protect them because all laws were supposed to rest upon them. Man appeared as the only sovereign in matters of law, as the people was proclaimed the only sovereign in matters of government. The people's sovereignty was not proclaimed by the grace of God, but in the name of man, so that it seemed only by natural that the unalienable rights of man would find their guarantee and become an unalienable part of the right of the people to sovereign self-government. So what she says, to sum up, she noticed that before adopting a constitution, the French National Assembly in 1789 proclaimed the right of citizen and man as to prevent, in some way, the organization of the power that should be the constitution to control, to reduce right of man. What she said then, that it is what happened finally. The government took control of the right of man and of people. And then she emphasized another tradition, which is the American tradition, but she noticed that this tradition was also attacked by the political leadership of the US. And on what point is that the United States declared, the United States Supreme Court in its very early decision, Chisholm versus Georgia, declared the man, the citizen, sovereign, not the state, the citizen. Because the issue you have when you say citizenship is the base of right is how you can be sure that you will not lose your citizenship, because then you will lose all the rights. So today we have two techniques, I would say, globally, to guarantee that. Other international conventions that prevent denationalization or make it difficult, etc. Or you have also internal jurisprudence on constitution. And as you know, the United States doesn't like international conventions. But within their own jurisprudence, they have decided that you cannot deprive an American citizen from his citizenship because in the United States, the state was created, contrary to European state, by sovereign people, sovereign individuals who transfer their part of their power to the government and not the power to be excluded from the social contract. And so you have the declaration of the sovereignty of the citizen. I will come back to it because I think it speaks to our time. In fact, if you look to contemporary philosophers who have mentioned this idea of the sovereignty of citizen, you have an Italian, Norberto Bobbio. Norberto Bobbio once said that in relation to modern democracy, which is supposed to be founded on the principle of a power exercised from below, one still wants to speak of sovereignty conceived as an origin principle, source and measure of any form of power, then this sovereignty does not belong to the people, but to each individual conceived as a citizen. So you have, endorsed by contemporary political thinkers like Bobbio, an approach that has been emphasized by Arendt. You will see why I speak about that, because now we'll come back to what was just said, which I agreed, is that in the aftermath of the Second World War, this affirmation of nation state, by the development of its numbers, by decolonization, by creating a lot of numerous citizenry, didn't go against the affirmation of rights for foreigners. And in fact, there is a seminal article by Peter Schuck about the transformation of immigration law that he applied to the US, that you could apply, that you can expand to a lot of Western countries. And you can remember the rights that has been developed and included in convention or in national law, the Convention on Refugee, the right to remain in the country after your permit has been renewed, and that was affirmed by the German Supreme Court in the 70s and in France by the resistance to Giscard d'Estaing's attempt to deport North African immigrants. You have the right of family reunification under certain conditions, and you have even the right for undocumented, including more and more mechanism of legalization. For example, in my country, you have like 7 or 8 legal ground for legalization, which lead to the legalization of between 25 to 40,000 undocumented immigrants every year under a legal frame that has not been to be exceptional and set by special mobilization. Nevertheless, we feel a regression. We are feeling a regression of the citizen sovereigns, the people, not only to give more rights, to increase the number of rights that has been proclaimed in 1948 for all human beings, but even to destroy the rights that has been attributed in the last 10 or 20 years. And I would say that, to speak roughly, I think there is a feeling that the sovereignty of the citizen, the sovereignty of the collective body of citizens, of the people, is declining in many areas, especially in the areas of economics, power, in the areas of trade, in the areas of... And so what seems to be remaining for the people is the power to decide who can enter and who cannot, who we are. And so the consequence of the regression of power in economic and social rights, as if we have to obey the banks and the regulation of IMF and whatever, is, okay, what remains to us? It remains to us who can enter in our citizenship, who can do that, etc., on cultural identity, etc. So I think one of the consequences is there, and it is we have to keep that in our mind permanently. It doesn't mean that we are not also helping sometimes, but not taking the floor or criticizing, as we should do sometimes, policies directly related to our topics. Let me give you an example I tell in my book. I'm just publishing now, the way the European Union speak about datas of migration today. I mean, the European Union reinforced populist reaction against immigrants by the way they count immigrants every year and forced the European Union members to count their immigrants. Of course, we are scientists, we could say that's conventional. We can, it's not a problem to add this category to this category. But who else in the developed world count the students as immigrants, except the European Union? And under which reasoning it has been done? Either by idiot demographers who applied a UN chart that was not applying at all was not set for immigration, either by racists who didn't want to say they were racist and who wanted to increase the fear of our compatriots towards immigration. So when people say that there are lies about datas of the EU about migration, I say yes, there are lies because EU gonfle inflate the numbers of real immigrants compared to the real numbers, because 80 to 90% of the students leave after their study, and because we don't publish the number of departure, the only number we publish is the number of arrival. Can you imagine that Canada, who has another convention, when they say 40% of our immigrants are workers, they count in their workers the family of the workers. And we put the family, all families together, the refugees, so that people can feel that there are a lot of families who seems not to work as we know they work, also the families. And so we doubly emphasize, we doubly increase the fear of our compatriots about the data. And who speaks against that if not us? Why don't we organize a petition toward the European Union to change the way they do? They force the states to publish data that are even not compatible with the United States, with Canada, etc. That's a shame that we have let that done, and that is our competence. And so, for example, in France, we say now we have 200,000 immigrants. Why? Because we have 60,000 students. Imagine the US counting the students among the immigrants. It will be like 4 million every year. If they would to announce 4 million immigrants every year, people would be, oh my God. And so we really plunge a bullet in our own body, you know, by accepting that and not reacting to that. So now let's speak about refugees, the refugee crisis. And that is not our responsibility, but I would like to tell something about that. You show the data, 600,000 applications for asylum last year, including a lot for Italy, and not a lot for France, but for Italy, Hungary, Germany, Sweden, from Syria. How many Syrians have been applied and received in the United States in the last 3 years? 1,200 in the last 3 or 4 years. Why doesn't the European Union speak about sharing, not only between the European states, but between all the world power that has been involved in the region, more than Europe as such, in the last 20 years? Isn't it the largest crisis we have faced since the Second World War? Isn't it that if we don't act internationally, two countries, Lebanon and Jordan, not to speak about Turkey, who are now for Lebanon and Jordan, have 1/3 of their population composed of refugees, will collapse, and then the crisis will even be much huger. So why can't we tell that the issue is not only European? And we obey. I cannot stand reading all the statement of Mr. Sutherland, who is the UN whatever representative for immigration, always saying what Europe is there, Europe. Europe is doing much more than Australia, who has been in war in Iraq, than the United States, who has started the war in Iraq. Okay, Europe does not enough, and my country does not enough, but we do much more than other continents. And I think we should stand and say, okay, let's do it together. And let's share the responsibility of a situation that is not only the European situation. So what I mean here is that if we don't take the floor on this issue, and if we keep saying, because this kind of issue, to our compatriots, oh, you are not open to liberal values, and we cannot be heard anymore. Because the day we will say, let's share the number of refugees coming from, and then let's have our part, then people can hear that. But if it's only Europe who has to, then they close their ears. So of course, we have also to act in a situation of crisis like that. Okay, we are all researchers, we don't do politics, but sorry to say that at some point we have also a responsibility in fields which are extremely politicized, not to say idiot things that have political consequence, or to say things that can speak to the politician in a way we want liberal outcome. How much time do I have? 5 minutes. Okay. So, last thing I would like to mention, because it concerns Switzerland. A few years ago, I've been contacted by a guy many of us might know, who has launched a very successful law firm, helping people to change nationality when they are wealthy. He wanted to do a dissertation with me. He's finally doing it in Zurich. And he has kept inviting every of us to conferences, to speak about citizenship by investment, how you can, when you are a wealthy American and a wealthy whatever, you can go and become, by paying $250,000, a citizen of St. Kitts, of Malta, without paying tax. And anytime you get a citizenship passed, he takes a fee for his law firm. And so that's a fantastic business for him. So I've been approached, I've attended one, and I said, I cannot stand there because I'm against what you do. So bye-bye. Other colleagues have been approached. Some have gone and went back and whatever. We have to talk seriously about that. Because if you go to the extreme of liberal thought, say, okay, why not having the citizenship on the market, etc., and have the wealthiest, choose where they want to stay, etc., etc. And then you say, oh, look at these people who become National Front or whatever extreme right, because they don't have the means to buy their citizenship, to change, etc. They are stuck in where they are born, and we participate to their feeling by saying it's fantastic, these new things, a new approach of citizenship, etc., etc. And so here, again, we have a responsibility, I think, to say that the wealthy people have to participate to the distribution of wealth in their country that has made them successful, toward the citizens who are less successful, because that's part of a kind of social contract they are part of. And so we have to rethink absolute liberal thought within a communitarian one, and I think Rainer can speak more than me about that, because otherwise I don't think we go in a good direction for every of our countries. And I'm not sure I have the theoretical, absolute all the theoretical means of answering to this kind of challenge, but I feel it's a very bad direction to think it's, why not doing that? And so I will conclude on that, saying that in that special case, absolute liberalism lead to restriction, to reaction, populist reaction of our compatriots. And so we have to have, even when we don't have the total, theoretical means of answering, etc., I think we could have the perception that some directions are not the one that are just, that are fair, and so we should fight them. And in Switzerland, especially, I encourage you to do that for this kind of business that I think is not bringing justice and fairness between citizens of the world. Thank you very much.
Very vibrant talk, and I maintain now that basically demographers have to go inside themselves and think about their criteria, but also that wealthy citizens should do more within their nation states in order, and not to escape like Depardieu has done, in order to escape their responsibilities. What I maintain by Giovanna Zincone is basically also the issue to which degree liberal values can really counterweight the majority will. And for that reason, I would like to know what Rainer Bauböck is discussing according to these two opinions we heard right now. Thank you.
I'd like to know myself.
Maybe we can explore with the audience.
Rainer, since we are all reminding you of our memory, I remember that in 1998 you first presented the hypothesis that mobility around the world was strictly linked to the status, to the economic status and to other kind of status. Do you know? In Australia.
Did I ever say so? I renounce. Anyway, let me try to do my task. I'll first go quickly through some ad hoc comments on Patrick's passionate speech, and then I'll weave in some comments on Giovanna into some points that I actually prepared before this, because I didn't have any papers to prepare otherwise. So, Patrick, first point here, this very interesting observation that the big human rights agenda of 1948, and if you look what actually has become consolidated, is jus cogens, right? As an imperative and prescriptive human right, there is not so much left. I was amazed that you didn't mention the right not to be tortured, apart from the... It's not universally... It's not universally, yes, no, indeed, but... okay, so you were talking about implementation. Well, slavery is probably just as common as torture, I'm afraid, in practice, depending on how you define, but it's considered also jus cogens, so it's an absolute human right that cannot be violated under international norms. But the interesting thing about citizenship is there was a significant watering down from the Universal Declaration to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The Universal Declaration still sounded a little bit like Hannah Arendt. Every man has a right to nationality. And the International Covenant in the end said much more cautiously, every child has a right to nationality at birth, and nobody can be arbitrarily deprived of his or her nationality. And that's not the same thing. So there's no longer there's no positive human right of access to nationality. This is what we have to be aware of. So the salience of human rights is actually quite limited. Second point, Patrick wrote this beautiful book on the history of deprivation of citizenship in the US and how it was eventually overcome by the Supreme Court judgments that established the doctrine the citizen is sovereign and therefore we cannot take away citizenship against the will of the sovereign. That, of course, raises a puzzle, you know, and as you mentioned yourself, you know, you were going back and forth, the citizen is sovereign as an individual, therefore you cannot take away citizenship from the individual. But the citizen is only sovereign as a member of a collective of citizens. And in Periclean Athens, of course, there was ostracism. So citizens could be banished, they could be expelled from the community because it was the collective of all the citizens that was sovereign rather than the individual that was sovereign. And what the theme of this conference is actually exactly this tension between seeing the citizen as a sovereign bearer of rights that nobody and no state has the right to take away, and the collectivity of the citizens as being sovereign as a democracy, and therefore also having democratic powers to decide on the rights of their individual members, and especially their non-members. So we are still stuck with this dilemma that you know, is the common thread that we had in all these plenary debates. And I'll come back to that point, but just a side remark on the US. Now, while the US no longer takes away citizenship against the will of US citizens, it now starts to make it really difficult for the sovereign citizen to get rid of US citizenship, right? So they have increased, they have imposed huge fees on renunciation in order to prevent that citizens want to renounce for the sake of no longer being subject to the US income taxation worldwide. On your remarks, on your passionate remarks on statistics in the EU, I fully share. But let me say it operates both ways. You know, the EU has created this kind of doublespeak about migration, where on the one hand, migration is what third country nationals do, and EU citizens are mobile. They are not migrants. They are free movers, and we don't use the same terminology. So there is a tendency to inflate, as you said, migration when it comes to third country nationals, and there's a tendency to not deflate, but to keep entirely separate, as if it were a different phenomenon, mobility inside the EU. But at the same time, you know, now it's very often internal mobility that is at the center of anti-immigration sentiment and anti-immigration politics in the member states. So we have to find a way how to, you know, make ourselves and the public aware that these are very, very similar phenomena, sociologically speaking, that are regulated by different political and legal regimes. And the connection is to a certain extent artificial and is not reflected in domestic political discourses. On the Syrian refugee sharing, I think this is a very good point. EU does, of course, much more than Canada, US, Australia do. But then, of course, you can play that game also with what the EU does compared to what Turkey or Lebanon does, right? So the numbers are huge in these countries compared to what the EU has been willing to accept. And finally, on market citizenship, I could not agree more. I was also invited to several of these conferences, and at one point I said openly, you know, I'm interested in what you're doing research-wise, but I cannot support your political agenda, so I'm not coming, right? But there is indeed, I think the alternative to, I was slightly worried when you said this is about absolute liberalism. Well, this is market liberalism, but there is also political liberalism, which is not exactly the same thing. And what political liberalism should make us aware is that citizenship has to rely on such a thing as a genuine link between an individual and a political community. There is no way this can or should be regulated by markets, because that leads exactly to the kind of unjust distribution of citizenship that you've talked about. Liberals have been worried to accept that consequence. They don't want the market to rule the distribution of rights and citizenship, but they are also hesitant to buy a quasi-communitarian idea that rights have to attach to citizenship rights, have to be linked with citizenship status, membership, recognition as a member of the political community, because only then can you really have a secure right to have rights. So that is a theme that I want to develop now a little bit further. Giovanna has done a beautiful job in spelling out the main challenges, the migration policy challenges that come from perceived security threats, and they are not just perceived, they are real security threats, and economic threats that are linked to migration. But she also showed that there is a surprising resilience in some ways. You know, if you just look at these factors, you would expect it's all collapsing into racist, anti-immigrant, exclusionary policies, and this is not what we are seeing in Europe. Now, your explanation was mainly about, well, to a certain extent in the Italian story about party politics and dynamics, but it was very strongly about the role of constitutional courts and their rights protection, the role of international organizations and conventions, the role of market forces that need immigrants and therefore need also some kind of integration of immigrants, and civil society organizations and their advocacy. And all of these are very important elements of the protection of migrants' rights, but they are all sources that are somehow outside democracy. You know, there are imposed constraints on democracy from the outside. This is what you said, exactly. And this is where the worry and the crux of the problem lies. I think we have to, if we want to have a more secure foundation for migrants' rights, and also if we want to explain why there is such a strong resilience, we have to be aware that it depends on migrants being citizens. That's the crucial point. Having access to citizenship, but also in a way on their citizenship in their countries of origin. We have to see what the position of migrants is as citizens vis-à-vis several states and vis-à-vis several polities that provides them with a secure point on which they can stand when they defend their rights or when others defend their rights. If we don't rely on this, we run into this constant paradox that rights are being seen as protected by forces that are not under the control of the sovereign people, right? And that starts, you know, even with constitutional courts. There are domestic institutions, independent judiciaries, but if it's the independent judiciary that is the only guarantee for the protection of rights, then you will get the populist backlash, right? It's almost inevitable because they say this is not under our control. It ought to be the democratic legislator that makes the rights that are then protected by the judiciary rather than the judiciary using its power to interpret rights in a way that they actually make and define them in the first place. So, you know, excessive form of liberal rule of law outside democracy creates the backlash of populism. And you have to be aware, the populists see themselves today as the better Democrats. You know, they really represent the voice of the people. They really want the people to be sovereign. They want majorities to decide. And they see democracy is being disempowered by liberal elites that rely on all these external constraints on democracy. And the answer to this must be that we have to internalize these forces into democracy. We have to make democracy as rights producing rather than rights destroying, so in a way that it needs to be protected against by the external forces. Now, what's the specific problem for migrants? The problem of migrants is that they are seen to be outside in the sense of being non-members, or in the case of immigrants and diasporas, outside in the sense of being not in the jurisdiction where the rights can actually be applied. So this double outside position of the immigrant who is also an immigrant is the precarious position with regard to the protection of rights that makes them more vulnerable. What is the answer to this? You could say, as some people have suggested, for example, Robert Goodin in an essay way back in 1986 said, well, let's forget about democracy as protecting the foreigners. Let's look to international law and what it could do to protect them as foreign nationals. They could be not just by their state, protected by their states of origin, but then under international law, foreigners do have, of course, the right to diplomatic and consular protection, but for example, they cannot be expropriated in the same way that domestic citizens can be expropriated. So why can't we expand the rights protection that foreigners have as foreigners rather than as citizens? And of course, it's obvious what the limits to this are. This approach separates their rights protection from that of the resident population and makes it therefore also vulnerable and antagonistic. It's not the same regime. They are seen as being under a different kind of protector than the citizens that reside in the territory. The other possibility is to say, well, let's look at foreigners as residents, right? And let's hook up their rights protection to their status as residents. And of course, this is the big progress since World War II, that there has been this status of denizenship that has emerged where non-citizen residents actually have nearly the same rights, apart from the political rights, as citizens do. Again, one of the pioneers was the US in the 14th Amendment. That is the crucial amendment that spelled out what citizenship means. There is, first there's the definition by birthright. If you're born on the territory, you are a US citizen. And secondly, it says, and everybody enjoys the equal protection, everybody who is in the jurisdiction enjoys the equal protection of the laws. So that doesn't apply to citizens, it applies to residents. And that was actually used in some cases, for example, in the famous case, to give the children of irregular migrants access to public education, right? In Plyler versus Stowe, that was the case, right? So there is a possibility to say that residence counts, and residence gives you a normative claim to be not discriminated against and to enjoy equal protection with everybody else. But that, of course, is still something that doesn't address the migrant as a citizen, right? A resident is not the same thing as a citizen. So and therefore, the vulnerability stays. So my conclusion is, we have to think about a different conception of citizenship, slightly outside the box of the nation state or the state of immigration only, and bundle all of these elements together so that we can see migrants as actually enjoying a very comprehensive, multifaceted status of citizenship that makes them part of the communities that produce rights, not only that need to be protected against the violation of their rights, so that they can be seen as members of democracies that have the power to define the rights that will be enjoyed. So what are the elements of this? And I conclude with this. The first one is, of course, all migrants come from places and they carry with them the nationality of origin, and that nationality, which I call external citizenship, is relevant for the protection of rights, especially in the initial stages when they have not yet acquired claims as long-term residents. Secondly, temporary migrants still need protection in their states of destination. And what kind of protection could they have before they are long-term residents and can actually have access to citizenship? And we could think about them as having at least indirect forms of representation, consultative bodies, trade unions, ways to represent their interests so that they can feed into the policy-making process, although they are only temporarily here or in some other kind of status like subsidiary protection, etc., etc. Thirdly, when they become locally settled, longer-term residents, we have to think about how they could be seen as being automatically citizens, not in the state, for this to have to apply for naturalization, but in the municipality, at the local level. We have these 12 EU member states that grant voting rights to non-citizens in local elections for third country nationals, not just EU citizens, and additionally some Swiss cantons and Norway and Iceland do the same thing. So there is an emerging form of urban citizenship that is more accessible to migrants than national citizenship is, and they could be seen as participating in local democracy in a meaningful way in generating the rights under which they will be protected. Finally, the long-term residents must have access to citizenship under the condition that they don't lose their citizenship of origin. And if they can be dual citizens, it means that they may have a chance to participate in rights-making legislation in two countries, in their country of origin, in their country of settlement, which means that they will be much more protected in their biographical situation that connects them to both countries. And moreover, they gain freedom of movement, even beyond the borders of the EU. This is what dual citizenship means. It means every state of whom you are a citizen has an unconditional duty to admit you to the territory. They cannot exclude you in any way. So you have your mini Schengen zone if you are a dual citizen, and that is one of the major achievements of access to citizenship under the condition that you don't lose your nationality of origin. And finally, we have, of course, the experiment in Europe, which is EU citizenship at the supranational level. And what that does is quite miraculous. It transforms the inside-outside boundary between natives and migrants into a level boundary between the national level and the EU level. So the rights that you enjoy are protected under the EU level, but the EU is not just an international organization that imposes some international standards. It's a democratic polity of which the member states are part, in which citizens have direct representation in the EP. So these migrants are actually participating, again, as citizens in a supranational regime, but that regime is no longer like an external citizenship for third country nationals. It's an internal citizenship that is superimposed on the citizenship of their member states. And again, that I think is a great experiment that really could also be potentially emulated in other parts of the world. And you will be surprised. There are other regional integration regimes in South America specifically, but even in West Africa, less so in Asia, where at least formally there are supranational forms of citizenship with voting rights for regional parliaments and freedom of movement arrangements between the member states. So the EU could actually become a model how to transform the dichotomy between native and foreigner and the lack of rights protection into a supranational form of democracy that includes them also as citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. I would like to give to my two panelists the opportunity to react before I give the floor to the audience. Giovanna.
Well, no, sorry. I think first of all we should, let's say, distinguish between descriptive and prescriptive approaches. Because of course I perfectly agree with you, Rainer, when in your prescriptive part, with only some time overlaps with the descriptive, what we do already have. And if we look at citizenship as it is, and at the demos as it is, well, still the national demos has strong power to destroy or to undermine, to refuse rights to the immigrants in their own country. First of all, we will see that they have the right to accept or not accept refugees. Not that in theory they have to, but in fact they cannot. They can just discourage them, and this is an important right. But the most important right we have, according to the American Constitution, is the right to our John Locke and the other, let's say, father of our regime, is the right to survive, the right to live. And now, sometimes we do not give this right to our fellow foreigners. And so this causes a big problem. And if you look at this, at the very status of citizen, as we know, and as unfortunately we both know, as far as the Italian case is considered, well, the citizen in itself is not that important as far as social rights are concerned, because many social rights are given to the long residents, are given also to the documented immigrant, even though now, of course, there are moves to restrict the rights, for instance, inserting new kind of requirement. For instance, as far as social house is concerned, if you insert a long residence in the region or in the town, that's, of course, is something that does not favor, of course, immigrants. Okay, but apart from that, the real reason why the citizens or the center-right do not want to give the nationality law, to reform the nationality law. You know, Rainer, we are going on in Italy trying to reform the nationality law. I overview at least, so 10 projects are more or less the same, I want to say. Well, is mainly a symbolic reason. They do not want to have these people as part of their own population. So it is not that different from the ancient Greek, if you let me come back to the model. In the ancient Greek, you have all sorts of very acknowledged important mathematics, artists, sculptors, philosophers. Aristotle was a metic, but the citizenship was closed because the idea was we are we. We do not want other people to belong to our race, if you want, to our ethnicity. We should enter in a different dimension of the culture. Of course, it is not something that everybody, every single part of the demos share, but I think this is an important part.
Just one remark on the distinction between the sovereignty of the individual citizen and the sovereignty of the collective people. Of course, I know the distinction, but the fact that the Supreme Court has affirmed the sovereignty of the individual citizen, because it goes with another provision of the 14th Amendment that say that no state can oblige the privilege and immunity. So there is a mention of privilege and immunities of the American citizen and not of all people living in the US. It can have a concrete impact, both concept of sovereignty individual and privilege and immunity. Let me give you two examples. Recently, one European state has been leading in the policy of denationalization, which is the UK. There was a case in the US recently, Tsarnaev, who put a bomb in Boston Marathon. He has just been condemned to death penalty. He has been naturalized 1 year before he put the bomb on September 11. Yet the United States didn't try to denaturalize him because they knew they could fail on the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. So even if he is executed in the next years, he will die with the dignity of still being a citizen. You might think it's nothing, but in the context of Europe, where now many of our governments are trying these policies, I think at least in the US, the government is restricted, and when they use the drones and kill Americans abroad, the scandal is that they have killed Americans. If they had killed foreigners that nobody cared about, they would not be the head of the New York Times. So you have this kind of protection that has been ensured by the American jurisprudence that is not ensured in Europe. The second thing I would like to mention is that among the privilege and immunity, I think you have the right, because it's absolutely obligation under the Geneva Conventions, to have a document of identity. You might think it's nothing. Go to India, go to Africa. People, when you don't have a piece of document of identity, you are trapped in your village because you are known only by your neighbors. Your fame is just local. So if you have national benefits, you don't get it if you leave your village. So we are always thinking about creating new rights, but there is some basic ones we don't think about when we think about how to ensure development and stability in the region, etc. And the fact that some governments of Africa or India have developed programs of giving IDs to their citizens has changed the life of people because it gives them mobility, possibility of... and so I think we have also to rethink our own agenda of how we fight internationally so that we can also be more welcoming the migrants.
Thank you, Patrick. This is now the moment to switch to the audience. And I would like to know, have you comments? Have you questions?
Well, you will have questions for them. This is what you said.
Yes. What do you think about democracy producing rights? No, let's go ahead. Yes, I see here a hand. Anne Singleton over there. And here, yes.
Thank you. As I bear some responsibility for the introduction of the regulation on statistics in the European Union, I think I should speak in defence of what it was supposed to be and how it's been misused, very often by academics. And it was introduced to actually improve the previous situation where we had data that were completely incomparable, that were supplied on a voluntary basis, very often withheld by member states. And it's not really the fault of demographers. I won't absolve demographers of all the other crimes that they've committed, but in this case, it's not their fault because it was the administrative data that are the most problematic that are collected. These are the real counting tools of the state. And the reason that academics are at fault here is that they're not using them in a critical enough way. They're not applying a critical lens to what they're using. These are data that actually record the actions of administrations, of border control guards, they tell you more about how the state is operating than they do about migration flows. And what needs to be done is to understand that they have some use as long as you understand what you're using them for, and that they actually, the dynamics of international migration are not being understood because we're not seeing the invisible picture behind the statistics, what is not recorded in the statistics, and that's the reality of the new dynamics of migration.
Thank you,
so I have to speak in defence a little bit of it.
Yes. We collect a little bit of questions. Yes. Monsieur de Genève. Alessandro, tu peux so. No. Wait for the micro. The micro is coming. See, can you give please your name and...
Yes, Dario Ciprot, and I am a member of an organization who fights in Geneva for the civil rights of foreigners. And I don't know if the audience knows that foreigners in Geneva, long-term residents, as Rainer Bauböck mentioned them, are making 41.3% of the residents of the county of Geneva, the canton of Geneva. And those are deprived of any rights except the right to vote in the municipality, and we fight for extension of those rights to the boundary of the cantons. And I want to make an appeal to you researchers to support such an innovative organization in our county, because I think Geneva should be an example in that sense because of this huge mass of foreigners. And even more, I don't count the international people working in Geneva in that figure. So this was my plea to you as panelists and researcher to go into the gray area of local citizenship and not only a yes-no affair of national citizenship.
Thank you for this suggestion. Are there further comments? Raise your hands. Yes, here to the journalist from Geneva.
Yes, I have already been unmasked.
From mosque, come on.
Unmasked. Indeed, you told us so many great things, and in such good literary English that it goes beyond my grasp. So I will just try to ask two very simple questions. First, there was a time when there was a ready-to-wear answer to all migration problems. It was proletariats of the whole world unite. So the question is why...
Can you repeat it? We didn't understand.
We didn't understand.
Yes, you are too young to know that, but I remember when I was struggling on the side of Lenin that we shouted proletariats of the world unite.
World unite.
Yeah, internationally. It was still very much alive in the time of my other great friend Che Guevara. In those days, they also had a certain feeling of internationalism. And if we see what happened in the world over the past, let's say, 5 years, everywhere where the rule of the majority was restored, it was a slaughter of minorities. It was very bloody or less bloody, but it was a slaughter of minorities. So this is a question. I may have my hypothesis why today the only effect of the rule of the majority, restoration of some form of democracy in the Maghreb, in Myanmar, in Venezuela, etc., is at the expenses of minorities. And the second thing is that there has been times of great migration in the past. There has been with decolonization, there had been before with migration to the United States, there has been with the time of political persecution, I mean harassment in Europe in the 1930s or 20s, and there is a wave of big migration today. Don't you think it would be important to know of which type, in which historical phase we are, because we cannot address the migration issue of today if it is of the same time as mass migration to America or as a refugee seeking from the Nazi or Stalinism or from other situations. Are we in the 1930s? This is the question that everybody has in mind and nobody has the conceptual tool to address. Not even you, if I dare so say so.
Thank you. So, Patrick, do you want to respond first?
I want to first respond to the question of the Dadas. I disagree with your comment. I have been myself the head of the data collection on immigration body for 6 years in my country. We registered also, for example, asylum seekers, and we don't put asylum seekers among the immigrants that are officially announced as permanent immigrants every year in the EU data. So there was a choice that has been made among the registered, among the migrant registered by our bureaucracy to decide to add the student among them, and it was a choice that has been made for some reason, and the consequence now we are paying for it. The second remark I would like to make is towards the last comment, with which I totally agree. I think that even if you look back to the 50s and the 60s, international solidarity, the interwar period was a period of international solidarity. Even in the 40s, 50s, you had a feeling of international solidarity that has decreased in the last 50 years. So there is, when you say what kind, you have to know in which frame you are. I think it's not we didn't know at that time when people were facing migration in which frame they were. But I think they were thinking of a frame for their future. They were nations, but they were thinking of becoming internationalists, and they thought that reversal of capitalism will resolve all the problems. And I think what we are now is that we don't know where we go. We don't know if nation state is still the future, or if it's Europe. Europe is fragile. And I think we have a sort of historical insecurity that makes us insecure to welcome others. because we don't know where we stand. And I think that's the problem we are facing now. And it is what I say in my book, because we also have sometimes an historical insecurity about the past. For example, in my country, we don't include the colonial past in the history we tell about us, and so we exclude people who have come from this past, and they are nowhere except in their faith. And so if we want them not to be forced to be in an identity, in a religious identity, we are first to include them in our national history instead of rejecting them. And so that is also a question. To be able to welcome migrants, we need to know who we are, who we were, and where we go.
Le sens de la République.
Yes, that's it.
Rainer or Giovanna, do you want to react?
Oh, I don't know. A very trivial comment. Of course, the situation of present migration movement are far different from migration, for instance, from Europe into the United States. Okay, and at the beginning of European migration to the United States, as you know, not all the Europeans were welcome. For instance, non-Southern European, non-Eastern European, because Eastern European were Jewish and Southern European were Catholic and were also considered as part of the mafia embossed system. Anyway, what is important is try to understand also not just a general, enormous frame of migration, but understand also the migration in changes in time, and also changes in time rights conceived and provided in the receiving country. For instance, the United States at that time were quite ready to give vote rights. Then at a certain point they changed their mind because they understood that there was this boss system. But of course they weren't ready to give social rights for the good reason they didn't have such huge, important welfare. So now we live in a different situation. The receiving country has also some package, no? Some package of social rights. So they can think about that. Second, demography. Another trivial comment, I hope you allow me. We have an enormous gap between the South and the North or semi-North, which is a demographic gap and an economic gap. Once upon a time, this gap was filled by the horrible strategy of colonization. Now this gap is here. Can we really think that we can do anything in order to reduce the gap? Because either you do, I know perfectly that this is a long-term policies, but if we never start this long-term policy, the situation is never going to change. So I think that one of the reasons why I agree with the present Renzi leader is that put on the table for the first time after years and years the fact that we have to give more helps to the developing countries. So let's start with these small pieces of small measure 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can by the time probably make some step forwards. As we are now, there is really, I cannot see a solution.
Thank you, Giovanna. Rainer.
I'm very happy to hear that there is a campaign in Geneva to extend voting rights also to the cantonal level. But I really want to address the two questions raised by the journalist over there. And the first one, as I understood it, was why is it so often the case that transitions to democracy or restoration to democracy end up in slaughtering, expelling, or oppressing minorities? And I think the answer is that indeed, transition to democracy is fraught with immense dangers. If popular sovereignty is not established for a long time, it has to be learned again what it means and how it can be exercised. And if elites in this process behave irresponsibly and try to use this by saying, well, we define who it is that belongs to the people that is now becoming sovereign, then you end up in seeing ethnic cleansing. And unfortunately, this story is not one of the mid-20th century. It's ongoing. It's, for example, Myanmar, there's a real danger now that the transition to democracy will, and actually already means, massive expulsion of the Rohingyas, who are both people, it's on the same scale nearly as it is in the Mediterranean. What is the answer to this? The answer, I think, is that democracy needs an answer to the question who belongs to the people that is sovereign in the democracy. And it cannot be either the market that decides or the nation that already decides before democracy starts. It has to be an inclusive conception that everybody belongs who is really linked to that state through subjection to its laws as a long-term resident, birth in the territory, even first-generation immigrants, etc., etc. This needs to be put on the table, right? Who belongs to democracy should not be a democratic decision itself, but it must be answered in a democratic spirit. That's the main issue, and that is not happening in so many cases. The second question was, what type of migration are we facing today in Europe? Is it like the 1930s and people fleeing from the Nazi regime? And my gut answer is yes. I think we are faced with a situation of a similar type, because the people who are trying to climb into these boats and to be rescued face dangers that are comparable in some ways to the plight of those who were under Nazi occupation.
Be ready for war.
Yes, so what is the answer to this? It just means there is, first of all, a humanitarian duty not to repeat the shocking horrors that happened in the late 1930s and the 1940s, when boats of Jewish refugees were turned away in so many places. We have to draw this historic comparison as a matter of appealing to the consciousness and conscience of Europe, that this is always seen as the historic memory that has united the continent, that drives its spirit, that it's animating force. Never again, this is, this kind of war, the Holocaust and these atrocities. And we see them happening on our doorstep, and our answer is so similar to the answer of those in Switzerland, in the US, in other places, who didn't open their gates for those people who had no other choice than to seek refuge. Why is it so difficult? Why is it even more difficult in Europe today? That has something to do with the fact that Europe doesn't have the option to conceive of itself as a nation of immigrants in the same way as the US and Canada and Australia had. And that, again, is not a nice story, because it was based on colonialism and on subjugating and exterminating the indigenous populations. Europe has become a nation of immigrants based on a situation on which there was already, the nation states were already there. They cannot be created from fresh. So it has to be done through a transformation of our self-conception of what it means to be a member of European democracy, that no longer refers to these exclusionary ideas of nationhood that justify even doing this ugly ball game, if more refugees happen to land on my doorstep, then I will pass them on as quickly as I can to the next state, and the next state will then apply the Dublin III regulation and say, I'm not in charge, it's not my responsibility. This is the old Europe of the nation states of 19th century style. And we had hoped we would be beyond this. If the European Union, and I think this is something that Juncker mentioned to say at least clearly, and even Merkel said it recently, this is a bigger crisis than the Greek debt crisis and the Ukraine-Russian crisis. If Europe fails on this crisis, it loses its credibility as an integration project.
Thank you, Rainer, also for these words. I looked at the watch, it's now 3:35. I would say we stay here, with one exception, which is Patrick. And we switch over to the Best Paper Award, Rinnus Peninx. And I ask Rinnus Peninx to come here to the micro. Thank you.
Okay, thank you here for being here. And my name is Rinnus Peninx, as you may have heard. It may be surprising for you to find somebody here who has his name in the award and does the award himself. Actually, I have to say, it was not my decision. It was the decision of the board of directors of IMISCOE that there would be a Rinnus Peninx Best Paper Award. And the only thing I'm guilty of is accepting that decision. Okay, apart from the name, the basic idea behind the decision to have a Best Paper Award is to stimulate participants of the IMISCOE conference to participate with high-quality papers and to have these papers ready before the conference. This year, there was a little bit of a problem because we had advanced the date of the annual conference by 2 months, and that meant that the whole call procedure was shorter. So the deadline for papers was May 21. And then after May 21, the chairs and the organizers of sessions had only 1 week, so between May 21 and 28, to nominate papers of their workshops for this award. The result was that we had 17 papers nominated in this procedure. Now, each of these 17 have been read by 2 members of the jury in the first round. And the evaluation scores led us to have a short list of these 17, of 6 papers by June the 15th. And then, of course, the big work for the jury started. They had to read all these 6 papers before. And yesterday evening, we had a meeting with this jury, and we have made decisions on the best paper. Now, firstly, the not prize-winning, but second best paper, was the one of Eva Zirnd and Didier Ruedin. It's called Ethnic Discrimination in Hiring Decisions, a meta-analysis of correspondence tests between 1990 and 2050. The jury was impressed by this paper's clear and sound methodology of doing a meta-analysis of 42 separate studies in which discrimination in the first phase of hiring people for a job was measured. It was measured experimentally by sending in applications that were equally except for the ethnic national origin of the applicant. The jury found that this meta-analysis was done properly as a meta-analysis and thereby contributed to our knowledge on this topic that is very relevant today. The order, now, first of all, I have to mention also that the 2 authors are based here and are part of the NCCR program. So that's interesting to see. Although that did not make any argument for the choice, I see that the director is very pleasant and very pleased to hear this. The order of the authors suggests, but we're not very sure, but suggests that Eva Zirnd did most of the work and that Didier Ruedin was more the supervising element in this authority. We may be wrong, but we therefore invite particularly Eva Zirnd, but we also invite Didier Ruedin, because we have 2 of these certificates made, here to receive our official announcement of their paper being the second best of this conference. So Eva Zirnd and Didier Ruedin.
These are the two certificates. No, just one. Oh, okay, here you are. Okay. Okay.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. This brings us to the announcement of the real winner. And the winner is James Lawrence. James Lawrence wrote a paper called When Numbers Count. That part of the title is very clear. The second part of the title is a little bit more complicated. It says, community ethnic composition, prejudice, and the moderating role of inter-ethnic segregation for the contact and threat hypothesis. This is a mouthful of things, but I'll try to explain just in a few words. I'll try, and they will check, or James will check whether I'm right. You know, he has been working on this intriguing contradicting two hypotheses. There is the contact hypothesis that seems to suggest that the more people are in contact, the better their attitudes towards each other are, and the better their reactions. So it improves inter-ethnic relations. At the same time, we have a kind of rivaling hypothesis that says, well, the more people in your environment are of a different ethnic origin, the more you feel threatened, and it leads to negative attitudes towards these. Now, these are two hypotheses that are both confirmed in a number of studies, but also, let's say, rejected in a number of studies. What James did was say, well, maybe there is a factor there in between. We talk about numbers, we talk about segregation. Is it possible that the way, that the size and the form of segregation makes a difference, through which the two mechanisms behind these hypotheses work differently in certain circumstances? So if you have a high segregation that goes together with a strong segregation on the territory in one part against a non-segregated other part, you have little contact and higher negative. If you have segregation which is relatively spread among the unit that you're measuring, you may have more contact hypothesis effects. This is nice to try and find out in data whether that really works. And the findings demonstrate that it is not only the size of segregation, but it is the form of segregation that makes really a difference. It's an important condition for intergroup relations. I hope, James, that I, in these 5-6 sentences, did some justice to what you actually done. The jury found this paper to make a great contribution of bringing the role of segregation and its form into the intergroup relations literature and in the attitudes literature. The paper is innovative, it's well structured, it's well developed, and it's well written. And there was a clear consensus in the jury, 9 researchers, that James Lawrence's paper was the best one this year. So, James, may I invite you? I hope you're here.
So, James here is the certificate as a member of the editorial committee compliments, congratulations.
Thank you so much.
And, you know, I'm very happy to award you also a check of 750 euros, which is, you know, the very price. And please, this is a plea to consider to publish in comparative migration studies. You have already the review, so, you know, the road is done, so you just have to handle it in. And, well, just a few words on the, well, this is for you, by the way. Just 2 words about the journal. Comparative Migration Studies is a young journal. Well, it's already 2 years, so, you know, it's growing up fast. And we really like to attract good articles as a new peer-reviewed international journal, open access, which is the only one in the area of migration studies at the moment. So this means that your research is going to reach the whole community very easily, you know, and a lot of references, quotations, and so forth. So please take our journal, Comparative Migration Studies, into consideration, and we really wait for such many interesting articles as the one that James just presented here in the conference. Thank you, everyone, for...
Thank you, James. We will immediately follow you when you give your beer for this festive thing. Thank you. Just one last remark. Next year, there will again be a best paper procedure. So I would like you, as chairs particularly, and as organizers of workshops, to look at the deadlines for these papers. We need to have them before in order to make it possible to really read them and enjoy them, but also to. So this is an encouragement for you to nominate people next year for the moment. Thank you for being here, and an applause for Lawrence, James Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you, Tiziana. Thank you, Rinnus, for this ceremony. Now I ask Maurice Kroll for the closing remarks before of the coffee break and the last workshop session.
Yes, the last remarks indeed, and allow me to make a small comparison. In the beginning of this year, I was at the American Sociology Society, Eastern Sociology Society conference in New York, and that gave me a possibility to compare a bit with our conference, because it also has a large section of migration scholars. It's twice as big as our conference, more than 1,000 people are gathered there, and there's a lot of similarities in a way if you look at the panels and the papers in the Eastern Sociology Conference. Maybe the big difference, I would say, in the debates, and that's also true, I guess, for this last panel, is that the Americans more often go after each other. The egos are maybe a bit bigger in the United States than here in Europe. But I think the main difference, and that's something I want to emphasize, and also as a closing remark, is the social aspects of these two conferences. In New York, people often come for just one day or even for one afternoon to present their own findings. Plenary sessions like this, I mean, it's more than 1,000 people, are usually only attended by 100 people. If people go out for dinner at night, they go with 5 or 8 colleagues, small groups. So there's hardly any social interaction, I would say. And that's the really distinguishing part for IMISCOE, I would say. I mean, the plenaries here are always full. We have the dinner and the reception, and that creates a real atmosphere between colleagues. And that's why we call ourselves IMISCOE scholars also. And that goes between the generations, I would say, from young scholars to the more senior scholars. So that is a real important aspect of IMISCOE. And I think that's also a bit my concern, that now that we grow bigger with more institutes in the network, but also the conferences becoming more bigger with more attendees, that we really have to keep this community atmosphere and to be really a community of researchers working with each other in the research groups, in the panels, but also meeting up with each other. I want to end with a lot of thank yous and 2 announcements for the future. First of all, I of course want to thank the organizing institutes and network. I mean the FSF, of course, from Neuchâtel University, Geneva University, and NCR on the Move, a great new network. And especially, of course, people who did the organizational work, but especially Johnny. He was everywhere here in these last 3 days. So, thank you. And it was a perfect conference. And I myself experienced that too, because I hardly had any feeling that I was the coordinator of IMISCOE. And I didn't really need to step in on one occasion. So really, that was perfect. I also want to thank the network office in Rotterdam. It's less visible, but of course they have been working already for months to make this happen too. And I also want you to applaud for them. So finally, 2 announcements. The next IMISCOE conference will be in Prague, and most of you already know that, of course. It will be the last day of June and the 2 first days of July. The organizer is the Geographic Migration Center of the Charles University. So we are again in good hands for the next conference. And the theme will be migration and development. So and I think this conference really proved it, to have a real strong topic, that it really works, and also to create an attraction for legal scholars to come, for instance. So I also hope that this new conference will have that effect. Secondly, the board of directors of IMISCOE decided on Thursday that we'll organize IMISCOE PhD summer school together with Princeton University next year, summer. The host will be Doug Massey, Professor Doug Massey. And I really want to alert all the PhD students to apply for this great opportunity. Of course, you have to be selected in the end to get in, but we also decided that we will strongly subsidize students to make it to this conference. So please apply for this great opportunity. So a lot of exciting events ahead, and we still have a last part of panels, so please stay and go to the last panels, and afterwards safe travel homes. Thank you.